Why did everyone freeze when they saw her wrist? The weapons bay on the Aegis 9 smelled like burnt circuits and oil that morning, the kind of smell that clings to your hands for days. Kaylin Voss had been working there for hours, her fingers raw from adjusting delicate connections in the dark, when Commander Jackson Morrill burst through the door with his security squad. His face twisted like he just discovered something rotten, something that offended him personally. She was kneeling beside an open panel, tools spread around her feet when he started shouting. A low-tier mechanic has no right touching restricted weapons bay. His voice echoed off the metal walls, sharp and certain. She didn't have time to stand. Two guards grabbed her arms, slamming her down onto the cold floor, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The cuffs bit into her wrists as they yanked her hands behind her back, rough and practiced, like they'd done this 100 times before. Someone rifled through her pockets, pulling out her ID badge that labeled her as nothing more than maintenance staff. That's all they saw. That's all they ever saw. When one guard shoved her sleeve up, checking for hidden marks or devices, the Black Panther ink on her inner wrist flashed into view under the harsh overhead lights. He froze for half a second, his eyes narrowing, then he scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. Just a cheap tattoo from some back alley parlor. The cuffs were about to lock with that final click when the heavy door burst open with a clang that echoed off the walls. Admiral Roderick Hale stormed in, his uniform crisp, his voice booming like thunder over the ocean. "Release her now. Look at that tattoo. She's the last surviving Black Panther operative." The room went dead silent, the kind of quiet where you could hear hearts pounding, because the woman they were all mocking wasn't some lowly mechanic scraping by. She was the one operative every officer in the fleet had been trained to fear, the ghost from a unit long thought erased. But it didn't start with the cuffs. It started way earlier that morning with the kind of quiet buildup that sneaks up on you. Kaylin Voss had been on the Aegis 9 for 3 weeks now, blending into the background like she was part of the machinery itself. She was 26 with soft features, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup to hide the faint freckles across her nose. She wore the standard issue jumpsuit, baggy and grease-stained from real work. Nothing flashy or fitted to show off. Folks on the ship barely noticed her at first, just another tech fixing leaks and calibrating systems. The onboarding process itself had been designed to strip away any sense of dignity before she even turned a wrench. The quartermaster, Sergeant Hatcher, with his permanent scowl and tablet glued to his hand, hadn't even looked up when she presented her transfer papers. He simply pointed toward a pile of rejected uniforms in the corner, garments that were either 3 sizes too big or stained with the unwashed sweat of previous owners. When Kaylin reached for a clean pair of boots, Hatcher slammed his hand onto the counter, the sound cracking like a whip in the small supply cage. "Those are for officers, grease-stained," he sneered, kicking a box of scuffed, mismatched boots across the floor. "You take the salvage if you want comfort. You should have joined a cruise line, not a warship." She silently gathered the worn gear, her face impassive as he loudly joked to his assistant that they were wasting good fabric on deck rats who wouldn't last a month. Even getting basic ship access codes became a bureaucratic gauntlet meant to remind her of her inferior station. While new officers were given biometric wristbands that opened doors instantly, Kaylin was forced to wait for 3 hours outside the security office, standing while officers breezed past her to the front of the line. When the clerk finally called her forward, he didn't issue a wristband but a heavy magnetic swipe card that looked 2 decades old. "The biometric scanners are for essential personnel only." He dropped the card into the trash slot of the counter, so she had to fish it out with her fingers. "This will get you into the maintenance shafts and the waste disposal units. Don't try to access the promenade or the observation deck. The alarms will trigger and security enjoys the target practice." He laughed, a dry rasping sound, and signaled for the next person before she had even secured the card in her pocket, effectively erasing her presence before she had even left the room. Her assigned quarters were another calculated insult. Located in the deepest bowels of the ship, where the ventilation barely reached and the constant thrum of the engine vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a room but a converted storage closet, damp and smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid and mildew. The bunk was a metal slab bolted to the wall with a mattress so thin the rivets poked through, and a single pipe overhead leaked a steady, rhythmic drip of condensation that formed a slick puddle near the door. As she was unpacking her meager belongings, a passing patrol of junior officers stopped to jeer, one of them holding his nose theatrically while his companions laughed. "Smells like something died in there," he shouted over the engine noise, kicking the door frame to rattle the already loose hinges. "Perfect spot for a stray. Just make sure you don't bring any fleas up to the main deck." Kalen simply placed a bucket under the leak, the steady plink-plink sound marking the first hour of her shift. The humiliation extended into the most basic necessity of hygiene, turning a simple shower into a battle for endurance. The communal showers for the maintenance staff were programmed to run on recycled gray water, often freezing cold or scalding hot with no middle ground. As Kaylin stepped into the stall that morning, attempting to wash the grease from her hair, the water cut out entirely after 10 seconds, leaving her soaked and shivering. Outside the stalls, a group of off-duty logistics officers were leaning against the control panel, laughing as they toggled the main valve on and off. "Whoops, looks like the pressure is a bit temperamental today." One of them called out, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Maybe if you beg, we can find a few drops for you, or you can just rinse off in the waste disposal. It's all the same water anyway." They left the water off for 5 full minutes, forcing her to stand in the biting cold air before blasting it back on at a near-boiling temperature, laughing as they heard the hiss of steam, treating her pain as their morning entertainment. The degradation wasn't just in the living arrangements. It permeated the very food she was allowed to consume. Kaylin approached the synthesis dispensers in the lower mess only to find them locked out to her clearance level. A steward, noticing her confusion, didn't offer help but instead pointed to a murky gray nutrient paste vat, usually reserved for emergency rations during a blockade. "Fresh synth is for the crew who actually fly the ship." The steward sneered, slapping a ladle of the gray sludge onto a dented metal tray that looked like it had been pulled from a scrap heap. "This provides all the caloric intake a manual laborer needs. Don't complain, or I'll give you the batch that's been sitting since the last sector jump." Kaylin took the tray without a word, the texture of the food gritty and flavorless, while the officers at the next table loudly savored roasted meats and fresh greens, making a show of throwing their leftovers into the incinerator rather than offer a scrap to the lower decks. Almost immediately after her meal, she was assigned a hazardous duty cleaning task that was strictly against regulation for anyone without a protective exosuit. The safety officer, Lieutenant Brevin, who despised filling out equipment requisition forms, tossed her a simple rag and pointed toward the exposed thermal coupling of the secondary reactor. "It's leaking coolant fluid. Wipe it down before it crystallizes," he ordered, checking his nails. When Kaylin pointed to the warning sign that explicitly stated Class 4 radiation hazard, full armor required, Brevin rolled his eyes and stepped closer, looming over her. "Suits are for people we can't afford to replace. The radiation levels are minor. You might lose some hair or feel sick for a week, but you'll live. Now get in there and scrub, or I'll write you up for insubordination and dock your pay for a month." Kaylin climbed into the narrow, sweltering crawl space with nothing but her jumpsuit, the heat blistering her skin as she worked, while Brevin stood outside in the cool air, chatting on his comms about his upcoming vacation. That morning, as she moved through the lower decks with her toolkit slung over one shoulder, a group of junior officers spotted her heading toward the restricted area. One of them, a lanky guy with a smug grin named Ensign Hale, no relation to the Admiral, just a coincidence that made him think he was important, leaned against a bulkhead and called out loud enough for the hallway to echo. "Hey, grease monkey, you lost. That weighs for real crew, not the help." His buddies chuckled, shifting their feet like they owned the place. She paused for a second, setting her toolkit down with a soft thud and looked at him straight on, no anger in her eyes, just steady. "I'm here to work," she said, calm as if ordering coffee, but he wasn't done. He stepped closer, eyeing her plain clothes like they offended him personally. Working in that get-up, you look like you crawled out of a salvage yard. Who let you on a warship like this? The laughter grew, drawing a few more heads turning from nearby stations. Another officer, a woman with perfectly manicured nails and a lieutenant's stripe, chimed in with a fake sweet smile. Seriously, honey, if you're trying to blend in, at least wash the oil off your face. We have standards here. Kaylin picked up her toolkit again, adjusting the strap without a word. But as she walked past, Ensign Hale muttered just loud enough. Bet she's here on some charity quota. Poor thing probably can't afford better. What they didn't know was that every insult, every calculated cruelty, was being catalogued in a mind trained for tactical assessment. A short time later, Kaylin found herself in the ship's hydroponics bay, tasked with fixing a faulty irrigation valve that threatened the officer's private orchid collection. The botanist in charge, Lieutenant Aris, was tending a rare predatory fern when Kaylin entered. Instead of clearing the workspace, Aris deliberately knocked a tray of nutrient soil onto the floor right where Kaylin needed to kneel. "Oops," Aris said, voice dripping with insincere apology as she watched the dirt spread over Kaylin's boots. "Well, you're already filthy, so it won't make a difference, will it? Just clean that up before you touch the valve. I don't want your grime infecting my prize-winning specimens." Kaylin silently produced a brush from her belt and swept the soil while Aris turned to her comms unit, laughing to a friend about how the help was practically rolling in dirt like the animals they were. The sabotage of her work began to take on a more malicious and active form. Shortly after she left the hydroponics bay, Kaylin had spent an hour rewiring a complex junction box near the elevators, organizing the chaotic cabling into a perfect streamlined system. As she packed her tools to test the circuit, a passing midshipman looking to impress his superiors with a vigilant discovery waited until she turned her back. He reached into the open panel and violently yanked a handful of the color-coded wires loose, sparking a small short that blackened the wall. "What have you done?" he shouted, feigning shock as Kaylin spun around. "You're incompetent. You nearly started a fire." He immediately hailed the bridge, reporting a critical negligence incident by the maintenance staff. Kaylin stared at the frayed wires, knowing exactly what had happened, but the midshipman smirked at her while the reprimand came through over the comms, docking her credits for the damage he had caused. The humiliation continued in the turbo lift a few hours later, a cramped vertical transport usually bustling with activity. Kaylin stepped inside, pressing herself against the back wall to make room for two lieutenants who entered discussing weekend shore leave plans. The moment the door slid shut, the atmosphere shifted from indifferent to hostile. The male lieutenant, smelling of expensive cologne that clashed with the stale air, dramatically wafted his hand in front of his face, coughing loudly. "God, the filtration system must be failing," he groaned, casting a sidelong glance at Kaylin's stained coveralls. "Or maybe we just picked up some garbage." The female officer giggled, deliberately stepping on Kaylin's steel-toed boot with her polished heel, grinding it down as if wiping off dirt. "Careful," she whispered with a venomous smirk. "Don't let it touch you. Incompetence is contagious." Kaylin stared straight ahead at the floor indicators, her breathing even as the woman accidentally elbowed her ribs when the lift jolted to a halt. Upon exiting the lift, she was immediately flagged down by a frantic communications officer who had spilled hot coffee on a critical console. The officer, a jittery ensign named Ryland, didn't hand her a cloth but instead grabbed the sleeve of Kaylin's own jumpsuit, yanking her arm forward to use her clothing as a rag. "Wipe this now." Ryland shrieked, scrubbing Kaylin's arm against the sticky keys. "If this board shorts out, the Admiral will have my head. Use your back if you have to, just soak it up." The hot liquid scalded Kaylin's skin through the fabric, but she didn't flinch, allowing her body to be used as a cleaning tool. Once the console was dry, Ryland shoved her away with a disgusted grunt. "Great. Now you reek of burnt coffee. Get out of my comm center before you stain the upholstery. You're useful for absorbing trash." "I'll give you that." In a cruel twist of false kindness, A young lieutenant named Vance approached her near the airlocks with a data pad and a warm smile, asking for her expertise on an engine efficiency report. "I heard you're actually quite good with the intake valves," he said, handing her the pad. "Could you look this over? I want to make sure I got the specs right." Thinking this was a rare moment of professional respect, Kalen spent her entire 30-minute break correcting his calculations, adding detailed notes that improved the engine output by 15%. When she returned it, Vance didn't thank her. Instead, he walked straight to the commander's station, handed in the pad, and said loudly, "Here's that optimization report, sir. I had to redo the whole thing myself because the maintenance staff kept giving me garbage data. It's tough working with illiterates, but I managed to fix their mess." He glanced back at Kalen and winked, enjoying the praise for her work while simultaneously painting her as a burden. Down in the engineering bay, where the hum of engines drowned out most talk, Dr. Nuri Calder was overseeing a diagnostic run. She was 45, sharp-eyed, and always in a lab coat that screamed authority, the kind of person who climbed ranks by stepping on others. When Kalen entered to check a reported overload in the power conduits, Dr. Calder spun around, her clipboard clattering. "What are you doing here? This isn't a playground for amateurs." Kalen knelt by the panel, popping it open with practiced ease. "Fixing the overload, ma'am. It's tripping the safeties." But Dr. Calder wasn't having it. She hovered over her, voice rising. "I didn't authorize you. You think just because you're on the roster, you can touch classified tech. Look at you, plain as a bulkhead. Probably don't even understand half the systems." A couple of techs nearby snickered, one whispering to the other, "Yeah, she's got that homeless vibe going on." Kalen kept working, her hands steady as she rerouted a wire, but Dr. Calder leaned in closer. "Stop that right now. You're contaminating the area with whatever grime you're carrying." She waved a hand dismissively at Kalen's jumpsuit. "People like you belong in the bilge, not here." Kalen straightened up slowly, wiping her hands on a rag from her pocket. "The conduit is stable now," she said simply, meeting the doctor's glare. The room felt tighter, the other techs shifting uncomfortably, but Dr. Calder pressed on. "Stable. I'll be the judge. And if anything goes wrong, it's on you, Miss Nobody." As Kalen turned to leave, one of the techs muttered, "Bet she sleeps in that outfit. No wonder no one takes her seriously." The cruelty escalated when Kalen was summoned to the flight deck hangar. A group of fighter pilots were gathered around a jammed landing strut on a star fighter, taking bets on whether the stray could lift the hydraulic locking pin, a task usually requiring a mechanical exosuit. 500 credits, says she, breaks a nail and cries. One pilot laughed, tossing a credit chip into a helmet. "She's got arms like twigs." Kalen approached the strut, assessing the weight. It was nearly 300 pounds of torque pressure. She didn't ask for the exosuit. She simply gripped the lever, engaged her core, and with a slow, controlled exhale forced the rusted metal to move. The strut locked into place with a deafening clang. The pilots went silent, money forgotten. Kalen wiped the grease from her hands and walked away, leaving them staring, though one pilot quickly recovered his ego. "Loose hinge," he scoffed loudly. "My toddler could have moved that. Don't pay out, guys." It was a fluke. Later, Kalen was dispatched to the officers' gymnasium to repair a faulty climate control unit, a task that forced her to work in the periphery of the ship's elite as they trained. The gym was sleek, filled with state-of-the-art equipment and the scent of sanitized sweat. As she calibrated the vent on a ladder, a muscular commander, spotting her reflection in the mirror, dropped his weights with a heavy clang that shook the floor. "Hey," he barked, wiping his forehead with a towel before throwing the damp cloth directly at the ladder, hitting Kalen's leg. Distraction. How are we supposed to focus on combat readiness with a scavenger crawling on the walls?" A group of sparring officers stopped to watch, grinning as the commander kicked the base of the ladder, making it wobble dangerously. "Get down from there," he ordered, not out of concern for safety but out of sheer spite. "You're blocking the view of the ocean feed. Go fix a toilet or something suited to your skill set." The ship's annual Founders' Day celebration was in full swing that afternoon, and while the crew enjoyed specialized rations and music, Kalen was ordered to the officers' lounge, not to participate, but to serve as a human disposal unit. A group of intoxicated ensigns had decided it was beneath them to walk to the recycling chute, so they made a game of throwing their empty glass bottles and sticky dessert wrappers at Kaylin as she walked by with a trash bag. "Catch, servant," one yelled, hurling a half-eaten cake that splattered against her chest. When she flinched, the room erupted in laughter. "Look at that reflex. Maybe she's part monkey after all," another jeered. They forced her to crawl under the tables to retrieve dropped napkins, deliberately spilling drinks near her hands to watch her clean it up, treating her presence as nothing more than an interactive prop for their amusement. The harassment followed her into the corridors. While repairing a light fixture near the upscale officers' lounge, the door swung open and a party spilled out. A drunken lieutenant stumbling with a glass of red Illyrian wine collided with Kaylin's ladder. Instead of apologizing, he looked at the wine stain on his pristine white dress uniform and then at Kaylin. "You clumsy idiot," he roared, though he had been the one moving. "Look what you did. This is silk." He grabbed the remainder of the wine in his glass and deliberately splashed it onto Kaylin's face and chest. "Now we match, although red brings out the dirt in your eyes. Clean this up." He pointed to the floor. "And then pay for my dry cleaning, or I'll have you scrubbing the hull without a suit." His friends applauded the justice as Kaylin stood there, wine dripping from her chin, saying nothing, her eyes burning with a silent, terrifying intensity they were too drunk to notice. The cafeteria incident during the morning rotation was perhaps the most public display of disdain she had faced yet. Kaylin had joined the line for coffee, holding a battered metal mug she had brought from her quarters. The mess officer, a petty man named Corporal Vane who hoarded the good rations for his friends, watched her approach with a sneer. When she reached the dispenser, he reached over and flipped the switch to off right as she went to pour. "Machines down for maintenance." He lied smoothly, despite the steam still rising from the nozzle. Behind her, a line of officers groaned in annoyance, blaming her for the holdup. "Move it along, grease trap." Vane snapped, pointing a ladle at her chest. "Real crew need their caffeine. You can drink from the tap in the cargo hold." As she walked away with her empty mug, Vane immediately flipped the switch back on for the lieutenant behind her, laughing loudly as he served him a fresh cup. "Got to save the good stuff for the people who actually matter, right, sir?" Up on the bridge later that afternoon, Captain Ara Quinn was running drills, her 34-year-old frame tense under the weight of command. She was smart, always calculating, but the political pressures from higher-ups made her quick to snap at perceived weaknesses. When Kaylin reported in to confirm a fix, carrying a status pad, Captain Quinn glanced up from her console. "Who are you again?" "Maintenance." Kaylin nodded, handing over the pad. "Voss, ma'am. Systems check out." But the captain's eyes narrowed at her appearance, the lack of polish, the simple way she stood. "You look out of place up here. This is command level, go back below where you fit in." A few bridge officers exchanged looks, one chuckling softly. "Yeah, we don't need the janitorial staff cluttering the view." While leaving the bridge, Kaylin was cornered near the navigation charts by the ship's chief navigator, a man obsessed with pedigree. He blocked her path, using his stylus to tap the comms badge on her chest. "You know," he drawled, his voice oily, "I've checked the Academy rosters going back 10 years. The name Voss doesn't appear on any of them. No distinguished lineage, no honors." He leaned in, invading her personal space. "It unsettles the crew to have an uneducated stray wandering sensitive areas. It's like seeing a rat in a 5-star restaurant. It ruins the appetite. Do us a favor and stick to the shadows. It's where vermin belong." He pushed past her, checking his shoulder to ensure he hadn't made contact with her clothing, leaving her standing alone under the cold blue light of the star maps. But what none of them saw was what happened next. Moments later, Kaylin noticed a critical error on the navigational whiteboard, a miscalculation in the hyperspace trajectory that would send the ship drifting into an asteroid field. She picked up a marker and silently corrected the equation, saving the ship from a potential disaster. As she capped the marker, a senior navigator walked in, saw her work, and his eyes went wide. But instead of thanking her, he snatched the marker from her hand, erased her initials from the corner of the board, and scrawled his own signature in bold red ink. "Don't touch the boards," he hissed at her. "And if anyone asks, I solved this. A simpleton like you couldn't possibly understand vector calculus. You were just cleaning the frame. Got it. Now get out before I report you for vandalism." He turned to the captain who had just entered, puffing out his chest. "Captain, I've just rectified the trajectory anomaly. It was a tough solve, but I managed it." The condescension bled into even the simplest interactions, like when Kalen was navigating the narrow corridors of the residential deck to check a fuse box. She encountered a lieutenant commander struggling with a jammed door to his quarters, kicking the metal and swearing profusely. Without a word, Kalen stepped forward, utilized a specific torque wrench from her belt, and realigned the magnetic seal in seconds, allowing the door to slide open smoothly. Instead of thanks, the commander looked at her with sheer disgust, as if her competence was an insult to his rank. He snatched his key card from the slot and brushed off his uniform sleeve where she had briefly stood near him. "Don't hover," he snapped, stepping inside and hitting the close button immediately. "Next time, fix it before I have to wait. That's what we pay you for, isn't it? To be invisible and useful." The door hissed shut in her face, leaving her alone in the silent hallway. Even the sanctuary of the ship's library was denied to her. Needing a schematic for an older ventilation model, Kalen entered the digital archives, a quiet room lined with terminals. The archivist, an elderly woman who prided herself on the intellectual purity of the officer class, immediately deactivated the terminal Kalen sat at. "Restricted access," the archivist announced, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "These terminals are for research and tactical study, not for maintenance workers to play games." When Kalen politely explained she needed a blueprint, the archivist sneered. "Use your data pad in the hallway. I won't have the keys greased up by your fingers. Officers come here to think, not to smell the engine room on you. Out." She pointed a shaking finger at the door until Kalen gathered her things and left. On her way out of the library, Kalen encountered the ship's unofficial mascot, a stray cat that the engineering crew had adopted. Kalen knelt to pet the animal, scratching behind its ears, the only creature on the ship that didn't judge her rank. A passing security chief saw this and immediately stormed over, kicking at the air near the cat to scare it away. "Don't touch the animal," he shouted, startling Kalen. "You carry contaminants from the waste decks. Do you want to give it fleas or some lower deck disease? That cat is property of the ship, which means it's officer class property. Keep your dirty hands to yourself and stick to touching garbage." He shooed the cat away, looking at Kalen with genuine revulsion, as if her affection was a form of pollution. As the day wore on, the whispers spread like steam through the vents. In the mess hall during a quick break, a group of entitled midshipmen spotted Kalen grabbing a tray. One of them, a rich kid fresh from academy with daddy's connections, pointed openly. "Look at that one. Thinks she can eat with us. Dress like a beggar and expect respect." His friends joined in, voices carrying. "Yeah, probably scavenging scraps. Hey, miss, the trash bin's over there if you're hungry." Kalen set her tray down at an empty table, ignoring them, but the fake nice one among them approached. "Ah, don't be mad. We're just joking, but really upgrade your wardrobe. You stick out like a sore thumb." She took a bite of her food, eyes forward. "I'm fine," she replied quietly, but they didn't stop. The leader leaned on her table. "Fine, you look broke. How'd you afford to be here anyway? Charity case." The room quieted a bit, heads turning. Kalen put her fork down slowly. "Does it matter?" That shut them up for a second, but then the laughs came back harder. "Ooh, touchy. Guess we hit a nerve, poor little thing." She picked up her tray, leaving without another word, her posture straight as she walked out, leaving them to their echoes. The bullying took a dangerous turn in the cargo bay. Kalen was inspecting the gravity locks on a stack of heavy crates when a pair of cargo handlers, bored and looking for amusement, decided to override the safety protocols. "Hey, watch the rat dance," one shouted as he remotely disengaged the mag lock on a crate suspended directly above her. The massive container dropped 3 feet before the emergency brakes caught it with a terrifying screech of metal. Kalen didn't scream. She rolled instinctively, a blur of motion, ending up in a crouch 5 feet away. The handlers laughed hysterically, high-fiving. "Did you see her jump, scared little rabbit?" they jeered. Next time we won't hit the brakes, sweetheart. Stay out of our bay. They didn't see the cold calculation in her eyes as she noted their ID numbers, nor did they realize she had just executed a combat role with perfect form. The verbal assaults turned physical in the simulation room where Kalen had been ordered to clean the viewing glass while a tactical team ran a boarding scenario. The team leader, a bulky man named Sergeant Kale, was performing poorly, missing targets and moving sluggishly. When the simulation ended with a failing grade, Kale ripped off his helmet, his face red with embarrassment, and looked for a scapegoat. He spotted Kalen wiping the glass and marched over, slamming his fist against the pane right in front of her face. You're distracting my team," he roared, his spit flying against the glass. "How can we focus with the janitor staring at us like a lost puppy? You're bad luck." He grabbed a water bottle and hurled it at the glass, the liquid splashing everywhere, forcing her to clean the entire section again. "Clean it up," he spat, walking away while his team laughed nervously. "And don't look me in the eye again, or I'll have you thrown out the airlock." Just outside the armory, Kalen witnessed a rookie soldier struggling to reassemble a standard-issue blaster during a timed drill. The pieces were scattered and his hands were shaking. Without thinking, Kalen stepped in as she swept the floor, her voice low. "The recoil spring goes in before the firing pin, or it jams." The rookie looked up, but before he could thank her, the armory master, a scarred veteran who hated civilians, kicked Kalen's broom out of her hands. "Don't you dare instruct my men," he bellowed. "What would a janitor know about military hardware? You probably think the trigger is a spray bottle. Pick up your broom and shut your mouth before I report you for interfering with military readiness." He turned to the rookie. "And you, listening to the help, drop and give me 50. If she knows more than you, you don't deserve the uniform." Even the ship's medical bay wasn't a sanctuary from the pervasive elitism. Kalen had gone there to get a bandage for a deep cut on her hand sustained from a jagged piece of metal in the ventilation shaft. The medic on duty, a young woman more interested in her data pad than patients, barely glanced at the bleeding wound. She tossed a generic, low-quality adhesive strip onto the counter without cleaning the cut. Self-service for non-essential personnel. The medic droned, not looking up. "We save the back to patches and sterile wraps for officers who actually matter to the mission. Try not to bleed on the floor. The cleaning bots are expensive." Kalen silently applied the flimsy bandage, which barely held, while the medic laughed at a joke on her screen, completely indifferent to the pain of the woman standing 3 feet away. Back in the weapons bay that evening, where it all circled back, Commander Jackson Morrill was conducting his security sweep. He was 41, gung-ho to the core, always barking orders to feel big. When he saw Kalen near the container, tools out, he exploded. "What the hell? Low-level trash like you shouldn't be within 50 feet of this." He signaled his guards, "Grab her, she's tampering." Kalen stood up, hands visible. "I'm repairing an overload, sir. It's in the logs," but Jackson wasn't listening. "Logs? You're probably forging them. Look at her, dressed like she lives in a dumpster. No way she's legit." The initial seizure was brutal. The guards didn't just grab her. They executed a takedown meant for armed combatants. One guard kicked the back of her knee, forcing her leg to buckle, while the other twisted her arm to a near breaking point, enjoying the leverage. Kalen's face slammed into the grating of the floor, the impact splitting her lip. But she didn't cry out. She simply adjusted her breathing, her body going limp to minimize injury, a trained response that the guards mistook for weakness. "Look at that." One of them laughed, pressing his boot onto her neck to pin her down. "Folds like a cheap deck of cards. No fight in her at all." Jackson loomed over her, nudging her ribs with the toe of his boot. "Of course not. Scavengers only know how to run, not fight. Get her up. I want everyone to see us dragging this trash out." The procession to the brig was a public spectacle designed to maximize shame. Jackson ordered the guards to take the long route, marching Kalen through the busy recreation deck where the off-duty crew gathered. As she was shoved along, hands bound and head held high despite the blood on her lip, the room fell silent before erupting into whispers and jeers. "Caught stealing, I bet," someone shouted from a card table, finally taking out the garbage. Another voice rang out, followed by a chorus of laughter. Jackson basked in the attention, waving to the crowd like a conquering hero. "We keep this ship clean, folks. No rats allowed on my watch." He shoved Kaylin forward so hard she stumbled, nearly falling, which elicited a fresh wave of applause from the onlookers who saw her not as a person but as entertainment. Dr. Calder, who had followed the commotion, pointed accusingly. "I told you she was trouble. She's been poking around all day, probably a spy for pennies." The snobby officers piling in nodded. "Yeah, check her out. No class, no clearance. Bet she's selling secrets." Jackson smirked. "Cuff her tight, don't want her grimy hands free." As they forced her down, the insecure guard rolled up her sleeve, spotting the tattoo. "What's this?" "Some gang mark," he laughed. "Cheap ink for a cheap girl." Kaylin's voice stayed level. "It's just a tattoo." But the room filled with more mockery. "Just a tattoo, like you're just a nobody, lock her up." The pressure built, the air thick with their entitlement. One officer added, "She probably thinks she's special. News flash, you're not." Kaylin looked up at him. "Special enough to fix what you broke." That made a few pause, but Jackson pushed forward. "Take her to interrogation. We'll see how special she is." Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted from public humiliation to calculated cruelty. They strapped her into a chair bolted to the floor, the metal restraints cold and unyielding against her wrists. Jackson didn't just question her. He paced around her like a predator, invading her personal space to intimidate. He grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back to force eye contact. "You think you're tough because you don't cry," he hissed, his breath hot on her face. "I've broken insurrectionists, pirates, and hardened killers. A little grease monkey like you won't last 5 minutes." He released her with a shove, wiping his hand on his uniform as if her hair was filthy. "Turn up the heat." He ordered the guard at the console. "Let's see her sweat out the truth." The temperature in the room began to climb rapidly. A silent, suffocating pressure added to the tension. They dragged her through the corridors, passers-by staring. In the cold metal room, they shoved her into a chair, cuffs half on. Jackson slammed her file down. "Start talking. Where'd you come from, huh? Strength like that doesn't come from mopping floors." He banged the table, splashing water from a cup onto her face. Dr. Calder hovered. "If you don't confess, I'll report you for sabotage. The Aegis 9 doesn't need liabilities like you." The gung-ho team laughed. "Yeah, ship you off to a mining colony. Fits your look." The psychological pressure turned to physical coercion as Jackson grew impatient with her silence. He grabbed a digital stylus and a data pad, thrusting it into her bound hands, twisting her fingers painfully around the device until her knuckles turned white. "We don't need a real confession," he whispered, forcing the tip of the stylus against the pad screen. "We just need a signature. Sign it. Admit you were stealing tech to sell on the black market." He leaned his entire body weight onto her hand, grinding the bones of her fingers together. "Sign it or I'll break your index finger right now and tell the medics you tripped." Who are they going to believe? The commander or the thief? Kaylin stared at the screen, sweat dripping down her temple, but her hand remained rigid, fighting his strength with an immovable resolve that infuriated him further. The interrogation took a darker turn when Dr. Calder produced a syringe from her medical kit, the needle gleaming menacingly under the harsh lights. "We don't need to wait for her to talk," Calder said, her voice devoid of empathy as she tapped the syringe to clear air bubbles. "This truth serum is experimental. It tends to scramble the cognitive functions of those with lower intellect. But frankly, who would miss her mind?" She stepped closer, grabbing Kaylin's jaw to hold her head steady. "Hold her arm. If she twitches, the needle might hit a nerve. Permanent paralysis would be such a pity, or maybe an improvement." Jackson watched with a cruel smile, arms crossed. "Do it. Maybe if she's drooling, she'll finally look the part." Kaylin didn't struggle, her eyes locking onto the needle with a terrifying calmness that made the guard holding her arm tremble slightly. Kaylin wiped the water with her shoulder. "How long until you check the container logs?" They froze momentarily, exchanging glances. Jackson recovered. "What do you know about logs? Too much for a grunt." She shrugged lightly. "Enough to know it was faulty before I touched it." Captain Ara called in, pulled up the data on a screen. "Wait, she's right. The system was glitching." Whispers started. "How does a tech know classified specs?" Just then, Jackson moved to destroy the evidence right in front of her. He walked over to the terminal displaying the logs Captain Ara had found and typed in a deletion command. "Oops," he said with mock surprise, hitting the enter key. "Looks like those logs were corrupted. System error. Now it's just your word against the commander's." He turned back to Kalen, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "And who's going to believe the word of a stray against the hero of the sector? I write the history on this ship, girl. And in my version, you're the villain." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm going to make sure you rot in a cell so deep they'll forget you ever existed." But Jackson, face reddening, escalated. "Doesn't matter, she's hiding something, amp up the questions." He slapped the table again, closer this time. "You're nothing but scum. Even if you fixed it, no one cares." Dr. Calder suggested. "Inject the serum, dig out her secrets." An officer added. "Or strap her to the mag chair, break her." Kalen sat still, cuffs digging in, her gaze unwavering. In a last-ditch effort to break her spirit before the physical torture began, Jackson pulled out a small hollow projector and displayed the contents of her personal locker, which his team had just raided. He projected a holographic image of a small faded photograph found in her boot, the only personal item she had kept. It was a picture of her unit, the faces blurred by time but clearly showing camaraderie. Jackson laughed, distorting the image with a wave of his hand. "Look at this motley crew. Probably fellow gutter rats you grew up with. Did they die in a sewer too?" He deleted the file with a swipe of his finger, the image vanishing into static. "There, now you have nothing. No past, no friends, no proof you were ever anything but dirt." For the first time, Kalen's jaw tightened, a micro-expression of rage that Jackson was too arrogant to recognize as a warning sign of imminent violence. The tension cracked when the door flew open. Admiral Hale entered, face storm dark. "Stop this." Jackson stuttered. "Sir, she's—" Hale cut him off. "Release her now." He pointed at her wrist. "That tattoo, Black Panther." The room hushed. Jackson fumbled the keys, hands shaking as he uncuffed her. Guards knelt. "Sorry, we didn't know." Dr. Calder stammered. "Procedure, sir. All bowed. Colonel Voss, forgive me." The moment the cuffs fell away, the physical dynamic in the room inverted instantly. Kalen stood up, rubbing her wrists, and the guards who had been manhandling her moments ago flinched back as if burned. She didn't attack. She simply rolled her shoulders and took one step forward. The guard who had kicked her knee stumbled backward over his own feet in his haste to retreat, crashing into the wall. Jackson, stripped of his bravado, looked at the Admiral, then at Kalen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Admiral, surely this is a mistake." He pleaded, his voice cracking. "Look at her, she's nobody, a forgery, it has to be a fake tattoo." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "She's tricked you, sir, she's a con artist." Hale's voice boomed. "The accuser is the saboteur." Screens lit with footage of Calder tampering. Gasps rippled. Evidence clear. Jackson was stripped of rank on the spot. Abuse of power. Kalen's clearance flashed. "Colonel, Special Ops." Whispers turned to awe. Jackson's downfall was visceral and immediate. Admiral Hale didn't just verbally demote him. He reached out and ripped the rank insignia from Jackson's uniform with a violent tear of fabric. The sound of ripping cloth echoed in the silent room. "You are unworthy of this uniform." Hale growled, tossing the epaulets onto the floor at Kalen's feet. "You are stripped of command, rank, and privilege. You are now lower than the grunt you mocked." Jackson stared at the floor, his face draining of color as the guards he had commanded just minutes ago stepped away from him, isolating him in the center of the room. He looked to Captain Ara for support, but she turned her back on him, staring resolutely at the wall to save herself. In a desperate, panic-stricken attempt to save himself, the navigator who had stolen Kalen's credit for the course correction lunged for the console on the far wall. He began frantically typing, trying to purge the audit logs that proved he had overwritten her signature on the digital whiteboard file. "It was just a glitch, I can explain." He shouted, sweat flying from his brow as the delete bar loaded. Kalen didn't even move to stop him. She simply watched him, arms crossed, as the screen suddenly flashed. "Access denied. Command override." The system locked him out, displaying his ID as the attempted perpetrator of data fraud. He slumped against the wall, realizing that the maintenance girl had likely encrypted the true logs hours ago, anticipating his treachery. The silence in the room was deafening as he realized his career had ended the moment he picked up that red marker. But the mockers weren't done grasping. As Calder was cuffed, she yelled, "You have no family, just a tool." Jackson spat. "No life, no love," an officer sneered. "Panthers are dead. You're alone." Laughter bitter, Kalen's eyes sharpened. Suddenly, the ship's massive communication screen flickered to life on the wall, overriding the interrogation room's local feed. A high-priority clearance code flashed in red, codes that hadn't been seen since the Great Wars. The room froze as the seal of the High Command appeared, followed by a live video link. It wasn't headquarters. It was a view from a stealth shuttle docking with the Aegis 9. The voice that came over the speakers was calm, deep, and familiar to every historian of the fleet. "Permission to come aboard, Admiral," the voice said. Jackson's eyes went wide with terror. That voice. It can't be. He died in the Veil Nebula. Kalen's expression softened for the first time, a ghost of a smile touching her lips as she recognized the cadence of the man speaking. Then the outer door opened. Colonel Tyne Varro strode in, uniform sharp. The man thought lost 7 years ago. He crossed to Kalen, taking her hand gently. "Her husband, the bond hidden even deeper. No one's left you. Panthers never disbanded," he squeezed. "We're here," Hale announced. "Aegis 9 under Colonels Voss and Varro. The immortal unit returns." The reunion was electric, a moment of intimacy amidst the wreckage of careers. Tyne didn't salute her. He reached out and touched the bruise on her cheek where the floor grating had cut her, his eyes darkening with a terrifying fury as he looked at the guards. "Who touched her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried more threat than Jackson's shouting ever had. The guards dropped to their knees, heads bowed to the floor, terrified to even meet his gaze. Kalen placed her hand over his, grounding him. "It doesn't matter, Tyne. They are beneath notice." Tyne turned his gaze to Jackson, who was shrinking into the corner. "You called her trash," Tyne said, stepping closer. "You looked at a queen and saw a beggar because your own soul is empty." The ship erupted in applause, mockers' faces ashen. Kalen stepped to the deck, wind whipping her hair, ready to lead. The transition of power was absolute. Admiral Hale stepped aside, gesturing to the command chair, the seat Captain Quinn had occupied just hours before. Kalen didn't rush. She walked slowly past the line of officers who had jeered at her in the hallway, the gym, and the mess hall. Each one of them stood at rigid attention, sweat beading on their foreheads, terrified she would single them out. She stopped in front of Ensign Hale, the lanky one who had called her a grease monkey. He was trembling, his eyes fixed on the wall. Kalen reached out and straightened his crooked collar, a gesture of dominance so subtle it was devastating. "Your uniform is sloppy, Ensign," she said quietly. "Fix it?" He nearly collapsed with relief and shame. "Yes, Colonel." Immediately, Colonel. The first meal after the revelation was a study in terror for the officer class. Kalen and Tyne entered the main officers' mess hall, the same place she had been denied coffee and food earlier. As they walked to a central table, the entire room stood up, chairs scraping loudly. No one dared to eat. The lieutenant who had spilled wine on her was sitting 3 tables away, staring at his plate, his hands shaking so badly his fork rattled against the china. Kalen sat down, unfolded her napkin, and took a sip of water. Only then did the rest of the room dare to breathe. She didn't have to say a word. The silence was her command. They ate quickly, heads down, eyes averted, realizing that the stray they had starved was now the apex predator at the table. In the days that followed, reality hit hard. Jackson fired outright, slunk off the ship at the next port, his career in ruins. Whispers of his arrogance following him to civilian life where no one hired him. Dr. Calder's sabotage went viral on military nets. Her name blacklisted. Sponsors pulling funding from her research, leaving her isolated in a low-rent apartment, scrolling through job rejections. Captain Ara demoted for blind complicity, lost her command, shuffled to desk duty. Her political allies distancing themselves overnight. The midshipmen who jeered in the mess hall faced inquiries. One exposed for faking credentials, dropped from the service and shunned by his elite circle. Ensign Hale, the first to mock, got reassigned to remote outposts. His family connections useless now, fading into obscurity. The retribution for the quartermaster, Sergeant Hatcher, was particularly poetic. An audit ordered by Colonel Voss revealed years of skimming supplies and selling officer-grade gear on the black market, the very gear he had denied her. He was stripped of his rank and assigned to manual labor in the recycling center, forced to sort through the refuse of the ship. Kaylin visited the center once, ostensibly for an inspection. She found Hatcher knee-deep in scrap, wearing a jumpsuit that was torn and stained. He looked up, humiliation burning in his eyes. Kaylin simply dropped a pair of new high-grade boots on the table near him, the ones he had denied her. "For your work," she said, "try not to slip." She left him there, staring at the boots he could no longer wear as an officer. Midshipman Lena Royce, the ringleader of the mess hall bullying, found her social standing evaporated overnight. Her father, a prominent admiral, publicly disowned her behavior to save his own reputation, cutting off her allowance and influence. Lena was transferred to the sanitation detail, the trash duty she had mocked Kaylin for. During a shift, she found herself scrubbing the floor of the very mess hall where she had held court. As Kaylin walked by with Tyne, Lena froze, clutching her mop, expecting a lecture. Kaylin didn't even look at her. She simply stepped around the wet spot on the floor and continued her conversation, proving that Lena was no longer even worth the energy of a reprimand. The invisibility Lena had tried to force on Kaylin was now her own reality. The gym commander who had thrown the towel at Kaylin faced a physical dismantling of his ego. Tyne challenged him to a friendly sparring match during the morning physical training. The entire crew gathered to watch. The commander, usually arrogant, lasted less than 10 seconds. Tyne disarmed him, swept his legs, and pinned him without breaking a sweat, all while holding a casual conversation with Kaylin, who stood on the sidelines. "Form is sloppy." Tyne critiqued loud enough for the room to hear, releasing the gasping man. "Too much vanity, not enough discipline." The commander lay on the mat, panting as his subordinates looked on. The illusion of his superiority shattered permanently. He transferred off the ship the next day, unable to face the crew. The communications officer, Ensign Rylan, who had used Kaylin as a rag, was reassigned to a listening post on a desolate asteroid belt, a job that required total isolation and zero interaction with high command. Before he left, he was made to hand clean every terminal in the command center under the supervision of a junior tech. When Kaylin passed by the comms array one last time, Rylan was on his knees, scrubbing a stain. He looked up, terror in his eyes, expecting retribution. Kaylin just paused, looked at the sparkling clean console, and said, "Much better. See what happens when you do the work yourself." She walked on, leaving him to his solitude and regret. His career effectively ended by his own arrogance. Even the archivist found her domain claimed by the new order. Kaylin issued a shipwide decree unlocking the archives for all personnel regardless of rank, encouraging self-improvement for every crew member. When the archivist tried to protest, citing tradition, she was reassigned to the cargo loading logs, a job involving zero intellectual prestige. On her last day, she watched as a group of young mechanics, previously banned from the room, sat at the terminal she had guarded so jealously, studying advanced engineering. One of them looked up and smiled at Kaylin. "Thank you, Colonel." The archivist had to walk past them, carrying her box of personal items, realizing that the knowledge she hoarded was now free, and she was the one locked out of the future. The pilot who had bet against Kaylin in the hangar bay was grounded for a month, not by official decree but by his own flight leader who had witnessed the display of strength. If a mechanic has more discipline than you, you aren't ready to fly. The flight leader told him in front of his squadron. The pilot was forced to run maintenance drills, the very work he had mocked. One afternoon, struggling with a heavy coupling, he saw Kaylin watching him from the catwalk. He stopped, sweat pouring down his face, and waited for the insult. Instead, she tossed him a specialized wrench he hadn't known existed. "It's all about leverage," she called down. He caught the tool, staring at it, then at her, finally understanding that the gap between them wasn't rank. It was character. Finally, Kaylin settled the score with the pilot who had scoffed at her strength in the hangar. She found him at the equipment requisition counter, arguing about the price of a replacement hydraulic pin he had broken during a rough landing. Kalen walked up, placed a small velvet box on the counter, and opened it to reveal a custom machined gold-plated locking pin. "I heard you have trouble with standard equipment," she said, her voice smooth. "So I had this made. It's idiot-proof." The pilot stared at it, his face red. "The cost has already been deducted from your flight bonus for the next 6 months," she added. "Think of it as an investment in learning humility." She walked away as the quartermaster handed him the invoice, leaving him holding the golden symbol of his own inadequacy. Kalen didn't look back, her steps firm on the bridge, Tyne by her side. The crew saluted, the air charged with respect. She issued her first order quietly, the ship humming to life under her true command. One evening, Kalen returned to the lower decks, not to work but to reclaim the space. She walked past the converted storage closet that had been her cell-like room. It was already being gutted and turned back into storage. The leak had been fixed, ironically, by the very maintenance team that had once ignored her, who now scrambled to salute as she passed. She stood before the door for a moment, remembering the smell of mold and the jeers of the passing officers. Tyne stepped up beside her, placing a hand on the small of her back. "Does it still bother you?" he asked. Kalen looked at the empty room, then up at him. "No," she said, turning away. "It reminds me why we lead. To make sure no one else has to live in there." They walked away together, leaving the darkness behind them. The ship eventually docked at the Celestial Gala, an event the elite had bragged about for weeks in front of Kalen. They had laughed about how she would never set foot in such a place. But when the shuttles departed for the grand station, Kalen and Tyne stood at the entrance in full dress uniform, medals gleaming under the lights. The same officers who had mocked her now had to wait in line behind her, watching as she was escorted to the VIP platform, the place they had dreamed of reaching their entire careers. She didn't gloat. She simply walked past them, her presence a quiet statement that dignity doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to the Aegis 9 that went beyond command structure. Kalen instituted reforms that dismantled the class barriers that had rotted the ship from within. The lower deck quarters were renovated, the gray nutrient paste replaced with real food, and the degrading security protocols abolished. She promoted based on merit, not connections, elevating the mechanics and technicians who had once been invisible into positions of authority. The ship ran smoother, faster, more efficiently than it ever had under the old regime. Morale soared as people realized that competence, not lineage, determined their worth. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Kalen carried herself. She didn't rule with fear or arrogance. She led with the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and emerged unbroken. When she passed through the corridors, crew members didn't salute out of obligation but out of genuine respect. She remembered their names, asked about their families, fixed equipment alongside them when needed. She was still the same person who had knelt in that weapons bay with sore hands, but now the ship recognized her for what she had always been. A leader who understood that true power lies not in domination but in service. One afternoon, Kalen stood on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Tyne joined her, handing her a cup of real coffee, the kind that had been denied to her in that mess hall weeks ago. They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have survived the worst together. "Do you ever think about what they said?" Tyne asked quietly, about being alone, about having nothing. Kalen took a sip of her coffee, considering. "Every day," she replied, "but then I remember that I was never alone. I had myself. And sometimes that's enough." Tyne nodded, understanding. "And now you have a ship full of people who would follow you anywhere." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Not because they have to, because they choose to. That's the difference." As the sun set through the viewport, casting golden light across their faces, Kalen thought about the journey. The humiliation, the pain, the moments when she could have broken. And she realized that every insult, every cruelty, every person who had looked at her and seen nothing had forged her into something unbreakable. They thought they were tearing her down, but they were actually building her up, piece by piece. into the leader she was always meant to become. The final lesson came during a mission briefing weeks later. The Aegis 9 was assigned to a critical operation, and as Kaelin laid out the strategy, she noticed several officers who had once mocked her now sitting in that room, taking notes, following her every word. She could have called them out, reminded them of their past behavior, used her power to humiliate them the way they had humiliated her. But she didn't, because true leadership isn't about revenge. It's about showing people a better way. After the briefing, one of those officers, the navigator who had stolen credit for her trajectory correction, approached her hesitantly. "Colonel," he began, his voice shaking, "I want to apologize for how I treated you. I was wrong. I was arrogant, and I'm ashamed." Kaelin looked at him for a long moment, and he braced himself for her response. She could destroy him with a word, end his career with a single recommendation. Instead, she nodded, acknowledged. She said simply, "Now let's make sure this mission succeeds." She walked away, leaving him standing there, tears in his eyes, understanding that her forgiveness was far more powerful than any punishment, because she had given him something he didn't deserve, a second chance. And in that moment he understood what true strength looked like. That evening, as Kaelin prepared for sleep in her new quarters, spacious and clean with no leaking pipes, she thought about the tattoo on her wrist, the Black Panther. A symbol that had once been dismissed as cheap ink from a back alley parlor. But it was so much more than that. It was a reminder of who she was, where she came from, and what she had survived. It was proof that you can't judge a person by their appearance, their clothes, or the job they hold. You judge them by their character, their actions, their unwavering commitment to doing what's right even when no one is watching. As she drifted off to sleep, Kaelin's last thought was this. They saw a mechanic in a greasy jumpsuit. They saw someone beneath them, someone to mock and humiliate and forget. But she had always known the truth. That dignity doesn't come from uniforms or titles or the approval of others. Dignity comes from within. It's the quiet knowledge that you are more than what they see, more than what they say, more than what they believe you to be. And no amount of cruelty can take that away. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates, the one they ignore, the one they dismiss, until the moment they can't anymore, until the moment they see the tattoo and realize they were wrong all along. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and when it does, the whole world has no choice but to listen.